A series of unfortunate events. The Reptile Room, Chapter 7. My, said a voice from behind them, and the Baudelaire orphans turned to find Stefano, standing there, the black suitcase with the shiny silver padlock in his hands, and a look of brummagem surprise on his face. Brummagem is a rare word for fake, that even Klaus didn't know what it meant, but the children did not have to be told that Stefano was pretending to be surprised. What a terrible little accident has happened here. Snakebite. Whoever discovers this will be most upset. You, Violet began to say, but her throat fluttered, as in fact of Uncle Monty's death were the food that tasted terrible. You, she said again. Stefano took no notice. Of course, after that they discovered that Dr. Montgomery is dead. They'll wonder what became of those repulsive orphans he had lying around in the house. But they'll have gone. Speaking of which, it's time to leave. The Prospero sails at 5 o'clock from Hazy Harbor, and I'd like to be the first passenger aboard. That way I'll have time for a bottle of wine before lunch. How could you? Klaus whispered hoarsely. He couldn't take his eyes off of Uncle Monty's pale, pale face. How could he do this to him? How could he murder him? Why, Klaus, I'm surprised, Stefano said, and walked over to Uncle Monty's body. A smarty-pants boy like you would be able to figure out that your chubby old uncle died from snakebite, not from murder. Look at those teeth marks. Look at his pale, pale face. Look at those staring eyes. Stop it, Violet said. Don't talk like that. You're right, Stefano said. There's no time for chit-chat. We have a ship to catch. Let's move. We're not going anywhere with you, Klaus said. His face was pinched with the effort of focusing on the predicament rather than going to pieces. We will stay here until the police come. And how do you suppose the police will know to come? Stefano said. We will call them, Klaus said, in what he hoped was a firm tone of voice, and began to walk towards the door. Stefano dropped a suitcase, the shiny silver padlock making a clattering sound as it hit the marble floor. He took a few steps and blocked Klaus's way, his eyes wide and red with fury. I am so tired, Stefano snarled, of having to explain everything to you. You're supposed to be so very smart, and yet you always seem to forget about this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the jagged knife. This is my knife. It is very sharp, and very eager to hurt you, almost as eager as I am. If you don't do what I say, you will suffer bodily harm. Is that clear? Is that clear enough for you? Now get in the damn jeep. It is, as you know, very, very rude and unnecessary to use profanity. But the Baudelaire orphans were too terrified to point this out to Stefano. Taking a last look at their poor Uncle Monty, the three children followed Stefano to the door of the reptile room to get in the damn jeep. To add insult to injury, a phrase which here means forcing someone to do an unpleasant task when they're already very upset. Stefano forced Violet to carry his suitcase out of the house, but she was too lost in her own thoughts to care. She was remembering the last conversation she and her siblings had had with Uncle Monty, and thinking with a cold rush of shame that it hadn't really been a conversation at all. You'll recall, of course, that on the ride home from seeing zombies in the snow, the children had been so worried about Stefano that they hadn't said a word to Uncle Monty, and that when the jeep had arrived at the house, the Baudelaire orphans had dashed upstairs to hash out the situation, without even saying goodnight to the man who now lay dead under a sheet in the reptile room. As the youngsters reached the jeep, Violet tried to remember if they had ever thanked him for taking them to the movies, but the night was all a blur. She thought that she, Klaus, and Sonny had probably said thank you, Uncle Monty, when they were standing together at the ticket booth, but she couldn't be sure. Stefano opened the door of the jeep and gestured with the knife, ushering Klaus and Sonny into the tiny back seat, and Violet, the black suitcase heavy on her lap, into the front seat beside him. The orphans had a brief hope that the engine would not start when Stefano turned the key in the ignition, but it was a futile hope. Uncle Monty took good care of his jeep, and it started right away. Violet, Klaus, and Sunny looked behind them, and Stefano began to drive alongside the snake-shaped hedges. At the end of the at the site of the reptile room, which Uncle Monty had filled so carefully with his specimens, and which was now sort of a specimen himself, the weight of the Baudelaire's despair was too much for them, and they quietly began to cry. It is a curious thing, the death of a loved one. We all know that time in this world is limited, and that eventually all of us will end up underneath some sheet, never to wake up. And it is always a surprise when it happens to someone we know. It is like walking up the stairs to your bedroom in the dark, and thinking there is one more stair than there is. Your foot falls down through the air, and there is a sickly moment of dark surprise, as you try and readjust the way you thought of things. The Baudelaire orphans were now crying, not only for their Uncle Monty, but for their own parents, and this dark, curious feeling of falling that accompanies any great loss. What was to happen to them? Stefano had heartlessly slaughtered the man who was supposed to be watching over the Baudelaires, and now they were all alone. What would Stefano do to them? He was supposed to be left behind when they went to Peru, and now he would be leaving with them on the Prospero. And what terrible things would happen in Peru? Would anyone rescue them? Would Stefano get his hands on the fortune? And what would happen to the three children afterwards? These are frightening questions, and if you are thinking about such matters, they require your full attention. And the orphans were so immersed in thinking about them that they didn't realize that Stefano was about to collide with another automobile until the moment of impact.